Greetings, everyone. This is Brian Reisman, entertainment journalist and author here in New York, welcoming you to my Blu-ray commentary for Morgan, A Suitable Case for Treatment. This was the fourth film from director Karel Reisz. It came out in 1966. It was the first starring turn for both David Warner and Vanessa Redgrave, at least on film. They'd been doing theater before that. That pronunciation I gave you for the director is the more proper, I think, close to the Czech pronunciation. I'm going to say Karel Reisz, which is what a lot of people have done the anglicized version because I don't want to trip over my R's during this commentary. Now, British Lion was founded in 1919. This long-running company has been both a distribution and production company. They have a lot of interesting titles that have come out under their banner. You probably know many of them. Carol Reed's The Third Man, I'm All Right, Jack with Peter Sellers, the first Lord of the Flies movie, The Wicker Man, Don't Look Now, The Man Who Fell to Earth with David Bowie, and many years later, Robin Hardy's sequel to The Wicker Man, The Wicker Tree. The company name is rather befitting a film that has an animal theme running through it. And in fact, here we have the opening sequence with Morgan gazing at a gorilla in captivity in the zoo. Playwright, screenwriter David Mercer used the gorilla as a symbol for what Morgan viewed himself as. In fact, I found an interview with Mercer from Theatre Quarterly in 1973 where he talks about this. It's an interesting quote. He says, "Obviously, for me, there are very serious undertones to the play. The question of a man unable to live in the world as he experiences it in a conforming way, being beleaguered by images of animals as expressions of a free existence, particularly the gorilla. The gorilla was important because it's one of the most powerful animals in the jungle, but the least aggressive. It's very hard to pick a fight with the gorilla. They tend to go away. And so I think for Morgan, the idea of the potential for aggression and the capacity to destroy, as symbolized by the gorilla, was very important." Now, after that, he goes on to talk about the idea of intellectually and emotionally being committed to an ideology such as communism. He talks about being a theoretical communist, which I will infer to mean that it sounds better in theory than in practice, at least in a capitalist country like England. I'll get more into Mercer later on. I found a poster of Morgan, which shows David Warner holding Vanessa Redgrave. She's in a skimpy dress, one of her legs up in the air, with wearing high heels, and the gorilla looking over his shoulder, watching what's going on, and then sort of like this conga line of four supporting characters in the background moving towards them. It's sort of a sexier image and a fantasy for Morgan, but clearly not what's going to end up happening in the film. When the film came out, it was actually marketed as Morgan ! And this was around the time when many movie titles used exclamation points. I guess it's the same way that a lot of 80s songs had parentheses around certain names in the title. It's just kind of like a cultural affectation of the time. Now, if you want to get a copy of that poster, it's 450 pounds online, which is about $600 American. And also, using the gorilla is interesting because even if they're not overly aggressive, you don't want to piss them off. So this animal symbolism is highly relevant to the childlike way that Morgan sees himself and the world, but obviously not very realistic. So here I want to point out this particular location, Leonie's house, is still standing at the southeast corner of Campden Hill Square. It's number 13, and right there in the background is Hillesley Street beyond the side entrance. It looks the same today, actually. Campden Hill Square is located in the posh district of Kensington, West London, located adjacent to Notting Hill and near Holland Park, and it is about a half a mile west of Hyde Park. It's also interesting to note that Leonie's house is located about 3 blocks away from where pop singer Dusty Springfield would live between 1968 and 1972. Now, I do want to give a shout out to a great website called Real Streets, R-E-E-L Streets. It's one word. They're dedicated to finding movie locations predominantly in England, but in other parts of the world as well. Most of the locations I mentioned in this commentary, I researched and discovered through the Morgan film entry on their site, and then I did some further research on my own, checked Google Maps, also a lot of history of the area. I want to offer them kudos because they made it a little easier, and they also have a lot of great stuff on there for other films. I think I have actually one correction for them near the end of the film. There's the Royal Garden Hotel is where one of the locations is rather than a Dorchester, but I'll get into that later on. So as far as Morgan, in terms of the story, we don't get a lot of backstory here. There are no big flashbacks, no long-winded conversations rehashing the past, but instead we learn about the characters and their long-time relationships through the way they communicate and how they are reacting to each other now. Now you see Morgan coming in here. He's pulling off the sheets, tarps off of his communist pictures and his artwork and the taxidermy, etc. It's implied that she's gotten rid of him, But if that happened very recently, you probably wouldn't have that much dust, although it has also been pointed out that he hasn't created a new painting in 18 months, so that's an issue. You imagine that when they were younger, they met and they were more idealistic, and you learn about this over the course of the film. I mean, when it came out, David Warner was nearly 25 years old and Vanessa Redgrave was 29. So you can kind of imagine how, when they were maybe in their early 20s, how things seemed very different. Now, I just want to point out here, playing Morgan's mom is Irene Handl, and then, of course, there's Albert Mullard playing the wrestler known as Wally the Gorilla. He's going to play an important role later on. And, of course, Vanessa Redgrave looking stunning in white, very fashionable. It's interesting. This right here, we've got two different types of people that represents the conflict going on between Morgan and Leone. She comes from money. He comes from a working-class family of communists. I mean, he literally lives on the other side of the tracks. Once we see him visit his bedroom at his family's apartment, he's looking out over a railway yard. Now, Leone doesn't seem to be very political. I can imagine she probably is on the conservative side, given her upbringing and being upper class. And by the same token, I don't think he is that political either. I mean, he does this whole thing with the hammer and sickle routine, kind of putting it everywhere he can in the house, and talking about the bourgeoisie and kind of thumbing their noses at their ways, the way probably his mother thumbs her nose at him. But he doesn't seem to be really preaching that much either. It's almost like in a way to annoy people. Morgan's father was a hardcore communist and someone who doesn't sound like he has a very good sense of humor. His mother seems a bit grim at times as well, although there's some levity in the scenes between them later on. Despite their differences, Morgan married a woman of means and wealth. And meanwhile, Leone seemed to be rebelling against her upper-class upbringing by marrying this man who ruffles the feathers of her mother. But I guess also as an artist, he fascinates her. That's always an interesting profession, right? And he also has this childlike view of the world that's different than her. So when Morgan is confronting Charles, his agent and former best friend who's going to be marrying Leone in the wake of this divorce, he's telling him, you're bringing a sense of security to her, but she married me for a sense of insecurity, and you shouldn't take that away. So I think there's a lot of truth to that, actually. I think she likes the chaos that he brings into her life and makes it interesting. Morgan, on the other hand, seems to calm down around her, at least when he thinks that she's going to be coming back to him. He's been very agitated right now. There's that scene where he's chasing her mother out of the bedroom, and the mother probably feels like she's being terrorized, and he's merely more teasing her and giving her a hard time. But Leone smirks at this whole idea because she's amused by the whole affair. I think she likes the fact that he needles her uptight mother. So there's this sort of symbiotic relationship going on as far as these different class distinctions. But in the end of the day, she's falling in line with the upper class mentality. She wants to marry a man who's sophisticated and accomplished and probably likely to please her parents. So she admits this to Morgan in not so many words, but it's there. And I've come of the belief that there are two things marriage and love cannot really overcome. And one of them is problems with your sex life. If that goes away and doesn't come back, that's going to cause a major rift in your relationship unless both parties are cool with that. The other one, of course, is money issues. So, for example, if you're in a union where there's one breadwinner, and back in the 60s, it was generally the man when it was more conventional and traditional, and they're not pulling their weight or just not bringing in enough money, that can cause a problem. You could have two people who are bringing in the bacon and one of them's not doing very well. Or if you're both struggling or poor, that generally causes tension regardless of how much you care for somebody. There are a lot of different things that can affect a marriage. Actually, now that I think about it, a loss of a child is another one. That's actually something where when that does happen, there are some couples, they just can't get past it, and it has nothing to do with not loving each other, but there's just pain that's associated with that. Clearly, the issue here is class differences, which kind of comes down to money because, Morgan hasn't sold a painting in 18 months, and, he's not looking so great probably to a lot of her friends and everything else. David Warner does a good job of walking the line between being endearing and being grating, because he's very childish. I mean, look what he's doing right now. He's getting back at her, actually trying to win her back really at the same time, by being like that little boy in a schoolyard who plays pranks on the little girl that he secretly has a crush on. And at the same time, she's rather self-centered and enjoys the attention that she's getting from both men. I mean, she's very understanding. I give her a lot of props for that. But I kind of look at her and Charles and Morgan, and they're all kind of involved. They all have their own agenda. It's not that they're terrible people at all. I mean, they generally seem to be good people. Charles is actually kind of annoying. Then again, so is Morgan. But, sometimes I think they're all playing against each other, and it's not really helping anybody. But at the same time, it's been said that the character of Morgan is a fool, but also in the sense that he acts like the court jester who reveals a lot of truths that are uncomfortable and reveals a lot of flaws about the people around him, or her, so usually him back in those days. So it's very much true about his marriage, his friendship with Charles, the impending couple that's happening here, that coupling. Now, there are two versions of the Morgan story, in fact. I call them Morgan 62 and Morgan 66. So in the original television play, also written by David Mercer, Morgan is older, and he's been worn down through a lifetime of heavy drinking. And allegedly, this earlier version of Morgan was a lot more like Mercer in real life. In the TV version, Morgan was a writer, not an artist. Charles Napier was his publisher rather than his agent. Morgan was reportedly also more violent. Further, that wrestler character of Wally the gorilla was either really expanded or added in completely to tie in with the gorilla metaphor more, perhaps to show the type of alpha male that Morgan is not and that he wishes to be. There's also supposedly a woman named Jean who Morgan becomes involved with, and so that version of the story ends on a happy note. The character is darker, but he seems to find a way out of it. This version has a happier, more upbeat version of Morgan in a way. However, the ending is a lot darker. He dons that gorilla suit that almost at some point he can't get out of. He crashes Charles and Leonie's wedding and then ends up being institutionalized. So a little more of a playful version, even though he gets disturbing, but a darker ending. Now, look, a lot can change culturally in 4 years as well. 62 to 66, you had, by the latter half of the decade, you had the counterculture coming in. Societal changes were on the way. And film was starting to push boundaries a bit, particularly in America, actually. If you consider what was going on there, you had the Hays Code, which is, the motion picture production code that was instated in 1930 because there were a lot of films that people at the time thought were pushing boundaries, moral boundaries a little too far. Also, there were some stars like Fatty Arbuckle who got involved in very upsetting scandals involving sex and sexual violence and domestic violence, etc. So they kind of tried to clamp down on Hollywood. And that was starting to change here in 1966. By the way, we see Vanessa Redgrave getting into a sort of a half state of undress that also happens in Blow Up, although I think actually her top is completely off in Blow Up when she's trying to barter to get back some photographs that David Hemmings has taken of her and her presumably married lover, or perhaps they're both married, having an affair. So at any rate, there were films that started to challenge the Hays Code. In 1964, one of them was The Pawnbroker, which starred Rod Steiger as a Holocaust survivor and who became a pawnbroker in New York City and dealing with prejudice. And in that film, that was the first film approved by the Motion Picture Association of America that had a rating on it that featured a woman's fully bare breasts. 1965, the paradigm was also challenged by the cinematic adaptation of Edward Albee's caustic play, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, that co-starred Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. There was frank sexual language in that film, so it was not approved. It did not get a rating, and it was released, I think, with the warning of no one under 18 admitted without a parent. Then the film of this year, 66, with Blow Up, co-starring David Hemmings and Vanessa Redgrave, which broke down the barriers further with nudity and drug use. European films didn't quite have that level of censorship. There had been some nudity in European films prior to that, but they also didn't have that much, and they were pushing boundaries by the late 60s as well with films like I Am Curious Yellow, probably even more so than American films, particularly with sex and frank adult content. But, so at any rate, I actually think about some of the things in this film, like we had that. He's chasing her around the apartment here, and earlier he said, they can't call it rape if it's between a husband and wife, kind of implying that he's going to attack her. He does a lot of things like this in this film where he wants to scare people, he wants to intimidate them, and it's not working. But given the Me Too movement, there are certain things that just wouldn't happen the same way, or wouldn't be done perhaps as playfully as they are done here. Leonie's putting up with a lot of the physical things from him that she doesn't need to. She's a strong woman, and she doesn't really seem to think that he is a threat to her, at least not early on. But, stuff like this isn't going to fly too well today, and that line about rape certainly wouldn't. Later on, when he walks into the art gallery with a loaded gun to threaten Charles Napier, and Charles isn't even intimidated by that, takes it away from him and accidentally fires it. He doesn't freak out that much. With all the gun issues going on today, with all the mass shootings and the craziness, that's something people would react very differently to that, which is why it's interesting to watch these films and see what was handled more casually back then. It's clear that you can see her, she's taking a bath and he's still around. She's divorced him, but she's also not kicking him out. So that's rather interesting. Now, I also was thinking, when watching this movie, how the concept of mental illness, as shown here, how it might be handled by modern Hollywood. I mean, it's never really stated if Morgan is actually mentally ill or what exactly ails him, because he hasn't been properly diagnosed. It's clear that he's started moving into a childish fantasy world that is helping him cope with the fact that not only will he be leaving this lavish lifestyle that he married into, but he will also be leaving the emotional support system that she is offering. He's on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and we're going to see that by the time he gets to the wedding. You have to imagine the time period when this was made. It's the same thing when you have a film like Straw Dogs by Sam Peckinpah in 1971 being ultra-violent, things like that. I mean, that's a bit more shocking. Something like this or Virginia Woolf might not seem so bold compared to what was going on back then. I think Virginia Woolf more so than this film, especially for younger viewers who might not know what had come before. I do notice that when I watch maybe some European films from the early 60s, are not as uptight or buttoned up about certain subjects as American films are, not really just in terms of sex and violence, more so just in terms of dialogue and how our things are approached. So, here we go. This poor woman just can't get rid of him. And, again, Warner does a good job of making you kind of enjoy his performance, even though he's, a little out there. Now, right here, he is playing a tune called The Red Flag. It's a socialist song dealing with the sacrifices of the labor movement and uniting them in a sense of solidarity. It's interesting because that actually is sung to the well-known German carol O Tannenbaum. It sounds exactly the same. It's actually going to show up a couple other times here. So you don't actually, I don't think you hear any of the lyrics until he's finally in the straitjacket near the end. Now, I want to talk about Karel Reisz, the filmmaker, the director of Morgan. He's someone who might not have reaped his big box office dividends as a lot of his peers, but he commanded a lot of respect and worked on many Oscar-nominated films, or he created many Oscar-nominated films. In fact, 3 actresses who worked with him landed Best Actress nominations through their films with him: Vanessa Redgrave, Meryl Streep, and Jessica Lange. Now, his first feature in 1960 actually arrived near the start of the British New Wave of cinema, which lasted from about 1959 to 1963, and it featured, angry young men rebelling against their working-class roots and challenging the status quo. Here, Morgan is challenging the status quo, but in a different way. Now, Reisz was born in Czechoslovakia in 1926, and he was smuggled to England when he was age 11, right when the Nazis were invading his country. His wealthy parents stayed behind and they were murdered at Auschwitz. He attended the Leighton Park School, which was David Lean's alma mater, and he served as a British fighter pilot in the Czech division of the Royal Air Force for the last 2 years of World War II before going on to study chemistry at Emmanuel College. Now, he produced and directed documentary shorts in the late 50s, and one documentary feature in particular, We Are the Lambeth Boys, in 1959, which looked at youth culture of that decade. Reisz's feature debut was Saturday Night and Sunday Morning in 1960, a well-received adaptation of Alan Stillitoe's novel starring Albert Finney as a working-class man, with a lust for booze and a couple of women, one of whom is married. This was evidently a new character concept for British cinema. This was only Finney's second film, and his first starring role. Now, at the time of Reisz's death, the British Film Institute had reportedly placed at number 14 on their list of 100 best British films of the 20th century, Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. His next film came 4 years later. It was his adaptation of Emmeline Williams' 1935 play Night Must Fall. It's the second time that it had been adapted for the screen. Also starring Albert Finney, this time as a psychopath. He's an axe-murdering bellboy who begins working for a wealthy woman and seduces her daughter. Then he does Morgan. Then he goes on in 1968 to do Isadora, again with with Vanessa Redgrave, who plays the early 20th century ballet dancer and free spirit Isadora Duncan, whose semi-nude and nude performances created quite a stir in Europe. The other way, we saw the Hammer and Sickle there, which of course is going to come back again. And now, of course, we have The Confrontation with Charles Napier. So there were more films that Reisz did later on. He did The Gambler with James Caan in a Golden Globe-nominated role as a professor with a gambling problem. Who Will Stop the Rain with Nick Nolte as a Vietnam vet who comes back but gets involved with drug smuggling and a drug addict, and that landed Reisz a nomination for the Palme d'Or at Cannes. His biggest film was the adaptation of the 19th century period novel The French Lieutenant's Woman by John Fowles. That film starred Meryl Streep and Jeremy Irons, came out in 1981. She portrays a woman battling strict Victorian morality. And that film was actually written by Reisz's friend Harold Pinter, the famed playwright known for his scathing political and social satire and some absurdist works. Streep and Pinter both got nominated for that film. Her third nomination and his first. You might sense a common thread in a lot of these films, which is that Reisz empathized with outsiders as well as people who challenged societal mores of their time. There are only two other films he made after that. One was the Patsy Cline biopic, Sweet Dreams, starring Jessica Lange. And then in 1990, the PI tale Everybody Wins, written by famed American playwright Arthur Miller, starring Nick Nolte as a PI investigating a murder case and local corruption in a Connecticut town. That film didn't do well, and after that, he just focused on theater, directing plays by the likes of Ibsen and Pinter in cities like London, Dublin, and Paris. And Karel Reisz would die of a blood disorder in London in late 2002. I want to get to talking right now about this other man on screen, Sir Robert Stephens, who made his name on stage early on. He studied theater at Bradford Civic Theatre School in Yorkshire, where he met his first wife, Nora. He acted on stage in England throughout the 1950s. Director Tony Richardson brought him into the English Stage Company at the Royal Court at its inception in 1956, and then he performed in Epitaph for George Dillon on Broadway, which landed him a Tony nomination for Best Actor in a Play. I believe that was 1959. So this role here of Charles Napier in Morgan was early in his film career, which began in 1956 with an uncredited role in King Vidor's rendition of Tolstoy's War and Peace. He co-starred with Rita Tushingham, the girl from Dr. Zhivago, in A Taste of Honey, which won her a Golden Globe for Most Performing Newcomer Female in 1963. Stephens had a supporting role of Germanicus in the Cleopatra movie with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. He had quite a career. I mean, and I love the way he's handling Morgan here. The fact that his character just, no matter what Morgan does, brass knuckles, stiletto, it's not going to work. And it shows you how Morgan gets more and more desperate. He's trying to be intimidating, and even this guy, who can tell probably doesn't even fight people himself very much, can handle him. Anyway, so Stephens' 1995 obituary in the New York Times mentioned that in the 60s he was viewed by many as the heir to Laurence Olivier, who was then the director of the National Theatre and who had invited Stephens to join in 1963, leading to many good roles in Hamlet, Royal Hunt of the Sun, and other plays. During his second marriage, Stephens met Maggie Smith. They would marry in 1967. That would be his third marriage. And they appeared together in the latter half of the 60s in the film The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, and they did plays on stage like the Franco Zeffirelli production of Much Ado About Nothing, which was also later filmed, as well as Noel Coward's Private Lives and Hay Fever. Stephens would go on to appear in Franco Zeffirelli's film of Romeo and Juliet as the prince, and then land the lead in Billy Wilder's The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. That was a bit of a troubled production. It was an epic 3-hour-plus movie with 4 stories that the studio cut down to 2 stories. It did, however, feature the Loch Ness Monster and Christopher Lee, so there's some points there. But after he left the National Theatre in 1970, following a quarrel with Olivier, and then divorced from Maggie Smith in 1973, Stephens' career suffered. He became a heavy drinker. He continued on in a variety of 70s movies like The Asphyx, Luther with Stacy Keach, Ridley Scott's The Duelists. And then over the next 2 decades, he became a regular supporting player on British and American television series and miniseries like Holocaust, War and Remembrance, and Fortunes of War, occasionally starring in British shows and TV movies like Lindsay, Puccini, and The Box of Delights. He had smaller supporting roles in the late 80s in Spielberg's Empire of the Sun and Kenneth Branagh's Henry V, so he never stopped working, but he did have a career resurgence in the early 90s when the Royal Shakespeare Company brought him on board to play Falstaff in Henry IV and then play King Lear. So he received the 1993 Olivier Award for Best Actor for Henry IV, and he was knighted early in 1995, but sadly he passed away that year at age 64 due to complications during surgery. Now, he had 4 different marriages, 4 different children. One of the marriages, there was no children. He had 2 sons with Dame Maggie Smith, and one of them is Toby Stephens, whom you now know as John Robinson on the Netflix reincarnation of Lost in Space. So I think that's rather interesting. I didn't even realize that. Now, here in this scene, the 2 of them are going to be debating certain things, and there we go. We have Wally the gorilla. Now, in the background there, you saw a poster, and you're going to see it here shortly. There's a poster behind the counter, and there's going to be a poster behind Morgan. And it advertises Wally's wrestling appearance. However, it also mentions two real-life wrestlers. One is Johnny Yearsley, and the other is Spencer Churchill. And in fact, they were the real deal. So Yearsley was born in Cardiff, Wales, and started as a professional weightlifter. You see the names there in the background in the bottom. He won numerous titles before becoming a modestly successful wrestler in the early 60s. I'd read that he was kind of like the villainous type in certain scenarios. According to one press clipping, Yearsley was the first man in the UK to bench press 400 pounds. He was a wrestler for 27 years, and he died in February 1980 at age 50. Interestingly enough, he also trained Sean Connery, presumably for his role as James Bond. Now, like Yearsley, Spencer Churchill was also a successful bodybuilder turned wrestler because there was just better money in the latter career. He was born in 1929 and is reportedly still alive. He earned the title of Britain's best developed man in 1954. He also was an uncredited stunt player on the James Bond movie You Only Live Twice, another 007 connection, and his nickname was Mr. Muscles Unlimited. Now, when they come outside of the cafe here, Mom's Cafe, it's on Walmer Road in the Holland Park area of London, which is adjacent to Kensington. I believe the street is really not the same anymore. Actually, when you look at it in Google Maps, a lot of those buildings were torn down. I think actually the cafe is on the side of buildings that were torn down. A lot of redevelopment happened, a lot of new housing. So, to me, films are like time travel. You have places that are really no longer exist or no longer exist in the same form. Just like here where we see a Notting Hill Gate Station where the peacock emerges. So in real life, Notting Hill Gate Station is located about a half a mile from Leone's house. It was originally opened in 1868, then rebuilt in the late 1950s to combine two stations together and reopened in 1959. This station was redecorated around 2010 and 2011 with new ceramic tiling and a modified ticket hall. So again, this is not quite the way it looked. I like seeing some of this old architecture. It's funny, there's a lot of, sort of what might have been considered modern 60s architecture in some places, and that form is actually kind of coming back, and I'm seeing it a bit in Williamsburg and Brooklyn because my girlfriend lives there, and it's very strange. You see a lot of that around MIT. That's my dad's alma mater, and when I go home to Boston, I see that, some of those buildings. It was a different time period for sure, what was considered modern and sleek, although I have to be honest, I'm not terribly thrilled with new size skyscrapers either. So, at any rate, there's some other thoughts that I wanted to share, actually, about Karel Reisz, come from different people, actually. One of them was from Vanessa Redgrave in an interview she gave with The Hollywood Reporter in 2018. She was talking about how Tony Richardson, her late husband, the director, and Karel Reisz had the greatest influence on her acting career. She said, quote, "I hugely respected Tony and I hugely respected Karel. I took their points of view on film, on everything, to be remarkable. I just want to be associated with that and be worthy of it. It was more than just the work. It was more an attitude to life itself," unquote. And James Toback, who wrote the screenplay for The Gambler in 1974, which was his first screen credit, said that Reisz was his mentor, and also added, quote, and this is when he was speaking to Variety for Reisz's obituary, "From the late 1950s through the middle 1980s, Karel was, within the serious international film community, one of only a handful of directors accepted everywhere with the highest regard. His films always had a look of both propriety and elegance, but it was as a superb director of actors and a creator of stars on which Karel's esteem rested." Finally, I found an interesting quote from Karel himself when he was being interviewed by Roger Ebert about The Gambler in 1974. They discussed Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, Morgan, Isadora, and The Gambler. So Reisz said in this interview, "There's a line that connects those characters, and yet I'm always being berated because I don't just do one sort of film. There you have a serious drama, and a comedy, and a biography, and here's a thriller. What I try to do is make the style consistent with the character, that we start by knowing him and end by perhaps understanding him a bit." So, and it's true, a lot of directors can't necessarily move back and forth between genres. Stanley Kubrick was the rare director who could really just do almost any genre, and he might not always be a huge fan of it, but he managed to do it, and he was acclaimed for it. Of course, Karel Reisz was dealing with characters that were a little more oddball and different. Obviously, here you're dealing with a guy who's raised as a communist. You see all the pictures of the various icons up there. One of them, of course, is Karl Marx, who's widely considered to be the father of communism. He was a German philosopher and economist who first brought the ideology to light with the Communist Manifesto, which he wrote with Friedrich Engels in 1848. And then, of course, he wrote Das Kapital. He became involved. He never became involved with the movement. He he moved to England where he died, and interestingly enough, it wasn't until after his death that a lot of his ideas began to spread and to take shape under people like Vladimir Lenin. So there's a very idealized version of communism here. I mean, my mother was a Cuban refugee. Her family, had money. Her father ran a successful business. That's Trotsky, by the way. We're going to be discussing Trotsky later on. And so anyway, when Castro came in a couple years later, all the money was gone and they left the country. I visited Cuba 3 years ago. It's not in great shape. I mean, there are some beautiful buildings in Old Havana, but the place itself is just not, people have no money. They're poor. So it was an enlightening and depressing trip. Now, I want to talk about Bernard Bresslaw, who's right here, who's the policeman, the Bobby. While he has a small role in Morgan, he's had an interesting life. I mean, he did a lot of theater work throughout his career, and he got a boost early on from Laurence Olivier. Interestingly enough, he would replace him many years later in the National Theatre production of Home and Beauty in 1969. He performed in a lot of serious plays by the likes of Shakespeare and Ionesco. He also appeared in a dozen movies in the Carry On series, which was a British franchise that initially satirized various professions from the military to educators, but which then expanded to movie genres and famous films before moving into British institutions as well as popular activities like camping and beauty contests. In the States here, we'll have a series of films, like we had a couple airplane movies, I think at least 5 scary movies. Certain things are like a series that are focused on a certain type of film or genre to satirize. Carry On evidently was much more diverse than that. So Bresslaw played many different characters in the Carry On series from 1965 to 1975. His installments including Carry On Cowboy, Follow That Camel, and Carry On Girls. He also played different characters, including Sir Lancelot in 5 episodes of the Carry On Laughing TV series that emerged in 1975. I mean, talk about milking a concept, man. I mean, like, Carry On, like, that whole thing started in 1958. And for the next 20 years, mostly, there were 31 movies, including parodies of Cleopatra and Emmanuel, nearly 20 TV specials, and 3 stage productions, the last of which was put on in 1992. There was also an album in 1971 called Oh, What a Carry On, because, of course, you have to have exclamation points in that title. And there's some other Carry On film ideas that were scrapped, including one that parodied the American show Dallas. So I think, partially thanks to the work that he did in the Carry On series, especially as well as previously playing dim-witted Private Popeye Popplewell in a show called The Army Show, which ran on British television between 1957 and 1961. Bresslaw was frequently typecast as players who were nice but not terribly bright. I don't think his policeman character here in Morgan is that much different either. He's not a terribly imposing police officer and doesn't really seem like he's dealt with too many kooky characters, and maybe this is just the kookiest one of all. He's a nice guy, but I don't know. It's interesting. At least he's not a lot of hard ass, but at the same time, Bresslaw also broke the mold out of that stereotype that he had. In 1967, he portrayed the villainous Varga in the Doctor Who storyline, The Ice Warriors, and he also played the role of the gentle and noble, yet ready to rumble, Rel the Cyclops in Krull, this fantasy epic from 1983. The movie might not have aged that well, but I have a soft spot in my heart for it. It's from my childhood. It has great locations, fun studio pieces, and a good cast, including a young Robbie Coltrane and Liam Neeson. And just to wrap up with Bresslaw, I mean, among so many other roles, he played the landlord in Terry Gilliam's Jabberwocky, had a lead role as Gort the Giant in the Jack Palance fantasy adventure Hawk the Slayer. His last role on screen was in 1993, portraying the very big man at the Ministry of Telephones in an episode of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. Sadly, that year he died of a heart attack at age 59, just prior to going on stage to perform The Taming of the Shrew in London. I guess you're going to go out doing what you love? That's the way to do it. I guess dying on stage is another one that's actually happened with people recently. It's, I can't imagine. I don't know what that would be like. But, Morgan got positive reviews when it came out from the New York Times, from the New York Herald Tribune, from the New Yorker, Time Magazine. It had a couple of interesting taglines. One of them was, "Can one charming madman save the only thing in the real world that's lived up to his fantasies?" which really plays the line between fantasy and reality, perhaps fantasy and madness. And it had another tag, "The cinema's wildest sex comedy." Well, maybe not, but of course, I guess it depends what you were watching back then. So here we go. More of this kind of ridiculousness, and Leone's just going to go into the house and try to avoid the whole thing. And we should talk about Vanessa Redgrave. She, like David Warner, got her film starring debut here. a great British actor who has received acclaim on both sides of the Atlantic and a lot of awards. She's the daughter of Oscar-nominated actor, director, and author Michael Redgrave. She's been nominated for 6 Oscars and won one for Julia in 1977. Julia also got her a Golden Globe for the best thing in both the Best Actress in a Supporting Role. She's won one other Golden Globe for a supporting role in the TV movie If These Walls Could Talk Too, which I think came out about 20 years ago. Vanessa Redgrave has won a SAG Award, a GLAAD Media Award, 2 Primetime Emmy Awards, an Olivier Award, and a Tony Award. So there. But it's not just awards that make an actor great. I mean, it's fun to watch her in this film and then check her out in Blow Up, which also came out that year, and you see her playing a more desperate character with something to hide. Then contrast that with her playing Agatha Christie in Agatha in 1979, or listening to her do one of the voices for Cars 2. It's also fun to watch her play the arms dealer Max in the first Mission Impossible movie opposite Tom Cruise, where she's got this stern, serious personality, but a little bit of lightness comes out as well. She's got that nuance that she brings to her roles, and it keeps them three-dimensional. She's also done a tremendous amount of stage work. She was in a show, the British version of a show I just saw on Broadway called The Inheritance. There were 2 British productions, one in the West End. She was in both over there. The Inheritance is a 2-part, 6-hour drama in which she appears in the second act of the second part as the only female role. The play is about the lives of mostly young gay men coping with relationship issues today, dealing with the rise of Trump, learning about their predecessors, and learning about the legacy of the terrifying AIDS crisis of the 1980s. Redgrave herself has been involved in a number of different causes and does films that often deal with certain social issues. She did a TV documentary in 1977 called The Palestinian about the plight of Palestinians. And that was during the same year that she portrayed a Jewish resistance fighter in Nazi Germany in the award-winning Julia. She was later very outspoken about the Second Iraq War. She tends to champion causes and express political beliefs even if they are unfashionable, which I appreciate. As you know, her sister is actor Lynn Redgrave, who was nominated for an Oscar also in 1966. It's a rare occurrence when it happens with siblings. Their father, Michael Redgrave, is a well-known British actor who appeared in one of my favorite horror movies, the 1945 British horror anthology Dead of Night. In fact, after she spent a decade honing her chops on the stage, her first movie was with her father in 1958 called Behind the Mask. Now, Vanessa, whose sister Lynn and brother Corin both passed away in 2010, sadly, is the mother to Joely and Natasha Richardson from her marriage to film director Tony Richardson. She has a son, Carlo Nero, with Italian actor Franco Nero. They were married almost 30 years after Carlo was born, which is rather interesting. I should also add that Natasha Richardson sadly passed away at the age of 45, and this is a year before her Vanessa's siblings had passed on. She died of an epidural hematoma. I feel a little sad because she outlived her siblings and also one of her children. Joely is 55, still alive, still with us, which is great. Vanessa is in her 80s now and is still working. It's just fantastic. But I feel bad for that loss in the family. There's a connection I want to bring up between Vanessa Redgrave in real life and the character of Morgan in this film. Vanessa's family was very involved in the past with the Trotskyist Workers' Revolutionary Party. She actually ran for an East London seat in the 1974 general elections and lost. You can actually go on the BBC website and find a clip of her both conceding defeat and calling on the need for a socialist reform, really, much to the chagrin of some of the officials there. I think there's some people chanting in support in the background. There's a lot of people who are not wanting to hear it. She still maintains the same belief system today, and we'll discuss them in interviews. And the socialism versus communism thing gets sticky for some people, but kind of feel like, socialism is more of a democratic system. You put money into a system, you get something back. Communism is not democratic, and you put money into a system, most of it, and you don't get much back. You get crumbs. It's just very, I don't know, but I see her. She's definitely on the socialist side. There were a lot of splits between the various members of the party in terms of their different Marxist views, in terms of Lenin and Trotsky and different people. So it depends on how you want to interpret it. And here we go, another one of the animal scenes. When I watch this, I almost think, did they actually make love, or was it did it work out that she must have fallen asleep and she wakes up and he's there? More likely they actually did hook up. The thing that's interesting about this movie is that what I like about it is it understands that human relationships are messy and that breakups are messy. In this instance, her character wanted him to be gone in Greece much longer than he was, so that way when she came back, all of his stuff would be gone. She wouldn't have to deal with this, because it's very clear she still has feelings for him. And this is problematic because it's also playing a game with him. And people do these things and they don't always mean to do these things, but they do. And sometimes it's done on purpose and sometimes people just go with it. But if you're the one that's not being broken up with, it's a little easier to get away with that. And here, now, of course, he's recharged, not realizing that his stuff is about to be carted away. It's, I've seen this kind of happen before in real life where people are sort of broken up and then they kind of get back together, or one person likes the attention, but they're sort of moved on into something else. It's not fair. And at times, I think that as much as she's irritated, she's charmed by him. And so, she's kind of getting herself in trouble. So now I want to talk about Morgan Delt, the man playing him anyway, David Warner, who's about to lose his car. There's so much to say about him. The same thing was with Vanessa Redgrave. I've long associated David Warner with villainous roles, probably because my first exposure to him was in the 1979 thriller, Time After Time, in which he portrayed Jack the Ripper. And he was being pursued by H.G. Wells from Victorian England via the time machine to modern-day San Francisco. H.G. Wells, of course, played by Malcolm McDowell. That was a really fun movie. I really like that. It's still great. Warner was also the villainous evil genius in Terry Gilliam's off-the-wall adventure Time Bandits. That's a pretty wild fantasy. He's also had 3 baddie roles in Tron, including Sark, the right-hand henchman to the master control program of that computer world. And then, of course, I have to bring this up, the 1988 cult film Waxwork, in which he was the owner of that sinister place where young people would sort of fall into the display and become a victim of the scenario because it gets played out like in this sort of alternate dimension. He was particularly funny in Time Bandits because he was sinister yet funny, overreacting to many situations, his character blowing up someone or something that displeased him, like when he blew up Benson. I think he had turned into a dog and said, "I'm a reasonable man." But even though he could be great as a villain on screen, Warner could also be sympathetic in other roles, such as the mentally deficient man in Sam Peckinpah's Straw Dogs. He was a peace-seeking Klingon in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. He was Bob Cratchit to George C. Scott's Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, which was on TV in 1984. There's a great line that Warner has in Star Trek VI about how Shakespeare is better in the original Klingon. So about a decade ago, I think it was possibly the linguist who had developed this language decided to create a video piece or have someone create a video piece with just that, Shakespeare done in Klingon. So as we know, Morgan was Warner's starring debut in film. He had only done 2 movies previously, but one of them was Tom Jones with a young Albert Finney. By the time this film came out, Warner had been active on the London stage for 4 years, having joined the Royal Shakespeare Company in 1963 and playing the leads in many of the Bard's famous plays. In fact, he was reprising his popular Hamlet in 1966 when this film came out. So I want to take a break here for a moment because we need to talk about the tomb of Karl Marx, which is at Highgate Cemetery in Highgate, London. I love how Google Maps has it listed as a, quote, reputedly haunted historic graveyard, unquote. If you go through the photos online, you can recognize parts of it, and I did, from the opening credits to the British horror anthology From Beyond the Grave, the first story of which features David Warner. And there are other notable movies that have shot at Highgate, including the abominable Dr. Phibes of Vincent Price, the original Tales from the Crypt movie with Joan Collins and Peter Cushing, later on the Mike Leigh film High Hopes, and probably most recently, Fantastic Beasts, The Crimes of Grindelwald. So located in the eastern part of the cemetery, the tomb of Karl Marx, erected in 1956, commemorates him, his wife Jenny von Westphalen, and other family members. Marx came into London in exile in 1849 and stayed there until his death in 1883, which explains why the tomb is there. And as mentioned, his communist ideals didn't really take hold until later. Naturally, such a controversial grave is going to generate unwanted attention. People have tried vandalizing and even blowing up Marx's tomb in the past. The grave was actually desecrated twice in 2019, first with a hammer attack on the inscription that permanently damaged it, and later with red paint, the words "Doctrine of Hate and Architect of Genocide" are written across the stone monuments. I guess that was bound to happen in these days now, where you have even more tension in the world. I imagine that there's a lot of people that are really not thrilled that the father of communism has his grave there in England, which is, at one point before the whole Brexit thing was actually really doing very well in terms of its economy. I'll be curious to see what happens now. Because, over 10 years ago when I first went to England, it was $2 to the pound. Then it eventually dropped to $1.50. I think recently it was like $1.35. So Brexit did not help at all, that's for sure. Makes it better for guys like me who want to visit. At any rate, now this area that Morgan and his mom are walking and piggyback riding through is a little different. It was different then than it is now. If you look at photos today where they're walking, sort of to the left, just to the left of that, there's now a paved walkway, or perhaps it's a small road, meaning that either the site for the tomb was moved or some changes have happened at Highgate, presumably some restructuring, hopefully none that will inspire any poltergeist-type manifestations. And just to finish on Highgate, famous people who are buried there include author Douglas Adams from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, rock impresario and original Sex Pistols manager Malcolm McLaren, actor Ralph Richardson, speaking of Tales from the Crypt, novelist George Eliot, otherwise known as Mary Ann Evans, poet and artist Elizabeth Siddall, and scientist Michael Faraday. Now, I really do want to get back to David Warner because there's just a lot of different things I like to talk about with him. I mean, he's really capably balanced film, TV, stage, and radio work. In recent years, video games. He continues working. He was in one of the biggest movies of all time, Titanic, for which he was nominated for a SAG Award for Outstanding Performance by a Cast. One of his most recent roles was as Abraham Van Helsing in the Showtime series Penny Dreadful, plus the role of Admiral Boom in the sequel Mary Poppins Returns with Emily Blunt and Lin-Manuel Miranda. In 1981, Warner received an Emmy Award for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a miniseries or special for his role as Pomponius Falco in Masada. It was his second time up for an Emmy. His work speaks for itself. And he's highly suited to the role of Morgan. I mean, he's pulling off the endearing, annoying thing very well. He can make him look sinister, intimidating, but not really. You know that it's not that crazy. I also give him props because at the end of the film, he's put in a straitjacket and he's placed on a hook on a crane and dragged up in the air. It's one thing to be dragged up in the air and be hanging there and have your limbs free, but to be kind of constrained that way, I wouldn't be thrilled about it. I don't even like heights to begin with. There we have the hammer and sickle again. You're going to see the one in the piano too, which I love. Again, it's been noted by some people that the communist ideology really isn't that prevalent in here beyond a couple discussions with his mother and beyond the hammer and sickle, because I don't think he's that totally devoted to it. It's a basic ideology for him that he wants to, I think he's using it as a way to stick it to them. And Charles certainly can't stand it. So I think it's funny. But, I look at Warner and wonder why, unlike Vanessa Redgrave, he didn't get nominated for more awards, even like for an Oscar or a Golden Globe, but he also did a lot of genre pictures and TV series, and those aren't as popular when it comes time for awards or awards season. You're seeing the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences relax their stance on horror and sci-fi a lot more, especially in recent years. Then again, do awards really matter? Because you're going to love what you love, and validation be damned. Now, we know that there is a previous version of Morgan, and, he actually Warner was doing an interview with Neil Hendry of the BBC in 2016 about the film, and he explained that he felt that Ian Hendry, who played him the first time, really was Morgan. Now, as I mentioned before, unfortunately, that television performance is lost. We'll never be able to see it. Morgan seems to be a film remembered more in England than in the United States. Like, I found a big Guardian retrospective piece on this, but I don't know if some people know about it here, but it doesn't seem to get discussed as much. The fact that he thought Ian Hendry really owns the role makes me wonder what Morgan 62 really was like. It's a shame that we're never going to get to see it, but unfortunately it was common practice back in those days to not keep episodes or certain and movies, or really TV episodes, because reruns weren't a thing back then. Ian Hendry had a role in the first season of The Avengers. He was the only male partner to John Steed, playing with Patrick McNee before Honor Blackman came in. Then you had Diana Riggs, Emma Peel, and so on and so forth. And it's a shame because almost all of his work in The Avengers is gone too. There are little bits of the first episode that have been put up on YouTube. They were found in some private collection, these film canisters, but he really... It's too bad we're not going to see that. Then again, a lot of the early works of comedian Ernie Kovacs, the first appearances of Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show, a lot of stuff has been lost to the dustbins of time simply because no one thought they were going to be valuable. I guess it was considered disposable back then, entertainment. And funnily enough, it almost feels like that today because we have so much stuff on streaming right now. You have all these series that you hear about, but then every other day there's something new for you to watch. So things really get lost. I mean, even back in this time, there were so many movies being made, so much happening. It was impossible to keep off. And even now, it's even more so. My best friend Steve actually said, he's like, if they stopped making movies today and you tried to catch up with everything in the past, you couldn't do it. I would like to point out there were two cinematographers on this film, Gerald Turpin and Larry Pizer. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's Pizer. Overall, there's a general style, but you can definitely hear, for example, there's a lot of camera movement going on. So Gerald Turpin had a shorter career as a cinematographer. It lasted from 1961 to 1985. But his career started in 1945 as a focus puller before becoming a camera operator, then graduating to being DP. He actually shot a lot of cool films. There was A Spooky Seance in a Wet Afternoon in 1964. He shot 5 episodes of the Emma Peel Avengers in 1965, and then the film Oh, What a Lovely War in 1969. He was allegedly a focus puller on that classic horror anthology Dead of Night with Michael Redgrave. Turpin won 2 BAFTA awards for his cinematography, one in 1968 for The Whisperers, and then 2 years later for Oh, What a Lovely War. He also got a nomination for Seance on a Wet Afternoon, and he won an Oscar in 1984. According to the website for the British Society of Cinematographers, at the 56th Academy Awards in 1984, he received a technical Oscar, a scientific and engineering award for, quote, the design, engineering, and development of an on-camera device providing contrast control, sourceless fill light, and special effects for motion picture photography. In 1985, the system was purchased by Arriflex and later developed into the slimmer Vericon system, unquote. Now, Larry Pizer also had a very interesting resume that he racked up throughout his career. He mainly shot short documentaries in the 1950s before delving into feature films in the 1960s. Morgan was his 4th feature, I think, and 2 years later he would work with Reisz and Redgrave again on Isadora. Pizer was nominated for a Daytime Emmy Award for, and this is a mouthful, Outstanding Individual Achievement in Children's Programming, cinematographers for the ABC After School Special Stone from 1980. He worked on a lot of interesting films too, Phantom of the Paradise, the Alice Cooper concert film Welcome to My Nightmare, Time Rider, The Adventures of Lyle Swan, and then near the end, the sequel Mannequin on the Move. Maybe not something to be so thrilled with, but he also shot the Bruce Springsteen video for Dancing in the Dark, which was an early break for future Friends co-star Courtney Cox. It's hard to tell who did all the different cinematography here, but the two of them together, these two men, made a great combination. Speaking of documentaries, the producer was Leon Clore, C-L-O-R-E, who specialized in producing documentary shorts and features. He had 6 feature films to his credit, including Time Without Pity with Michael Redgrave and Lois Maxwell of Money and Penny fame from the James Bond series. Another film called All Neat in Black Stockings with Susan George, who was very popular in the 70s, and The French Lieutenant's Woman. Clore was nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary Feature in 1954 for The Conquest of Everest, which he shared with John Taylor and Graham Tharp. So here we are. And he's being called a class traitor by his mom. What are you going to do? This is Irene Handl playing Mrs. Del Morgan's mother. Now, she was born into wealth, but played feisty working-class women like maids, cooks, eccentric old ladies. She was a talented woman who did not start acting until the age of 36, first portraying a chambermaid in the film Missing Believed Married in 1937. She never stopped acting, appearing in British films and TV series for nearly every year of her life then on. She started acting on stage in 1938 and also had some success in radio. I guess the roles that Americans are most likely to know her for are Mrs. Kite, which was a scene-stealing turn as the wife of Peter Sellers, who portrayed a communist union leader in I'm All Right, Jack. She played Miss Peach in the original Italian Job with Michael Caine and Benny Hill 10 years later in 1969. Then she portrayed Sherlock Holmes' landlady, Mrs. Hudson, in The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, reuniting with Robert Stevens. That same year, she was also in the Barbra Streisand film On a Clear Day You Can See Forever. She had smaller roles in other films like Marty Feldman's The Last Remake of Beau Geste, a late 70s version of Hound of the Baskervilles, and Julian Temple's The Great Rock and Roll Swindle. She died in 1987. It is said that Handl is best remembered for her starring turn in the British show For the Love of Ada, which ran for 4 seasons and 27 episodes in 1970 to 71. It focused on the blossoming romance between 2 senior citizens. And here we go. Morgan is going to go into his lucid dream, I think. I mean, who doesn't want to have a dream where your bed is being rolled along a railway and your beloved is a Russian revolutionary figure who is going to shoot at you? But hey, this is Morgan's world. I just want to finish up with Irene Handl, who is a big fan of Elvis Presley, and also she wrote 2 acclaimed and best-selling novels. The Sioux, S-I-O-U-X, in 1965, and its sequel, The Gold Tip Fitzer, in 1973. Noel Coward praised her first book, and Peter Sellers praised both, even being quoted on the cover of the second. According to her Associated Press obituary, she started writing The Sioux at age 14, but didn't commence again with it until age 60. That's actually encouraging for older writers. Both books were reissued again in 1986 in the States, and you can find them for sale online and used in collectible condition. You just saw some sped up camera work there, that Keystone Cops thing, which has happened a few times in this movie. It tends to, it's okay. I guess it adds to the comedy a little bit. It's something that's a bit dated. It works a couple times anyway. It might not work every time they use it, but I guess perhaps it also ties into his state of mind. There's another quote that I want to mention, actually, something that Don Taylor, the director that had worked with David Mercer on his television work in the early mid-'60s, said about Morgan. It was just a write-up for the Radio Times for October 18th, I believe 1962, which is when the Ian Hendry version of Morgan was going to go on the air. He wrote, "Morgan is not just a nonconformist. He is a nonconformist for whom a beard and a guitar are as square as a dark suit and rolled umbrella. He refuses to wear any of the current uniforms, nor will he modify his distrust in order to find himself a place in society. He is his own strange self. But no man can live totally outside in a minority of one. That path leads either to laughter or to breakdown or to both," unquote. And as we know, that's going to, lead to both. Here we're learning, and this is another way we're learning about backstory, the fact that you actually get the vibe that Morgan and Leone actually possibly eloped or did like a city hall marriage, because her mother's like, "Oh, we're going to have a proper marriage this time." So this may have been very impulsive, something that happens when you're younger. I was never wanting to ever get married at that in the early 20s. I just think it's too early, because oftentimes this is what happens. You get divorced. There are lots of big problems. But anyway, something else that I want to bring up is sort of dealing with the nature of mental illness in reality. After watching this movie, I've contemplated, what would Morgan Delt be like in the England of 2020? Is he the kind of guy who, say, post-divorce would still be exhibiting strange behavior in public? Or would he turn into one of those people lurking around in social media and provoking and needling people? Like, I have an online friend or two who I call like virtual hermits. They have jobs and they go out a bit because they have to, but it seems like a lot of their life and interactions actually happen in the digital realm. And I imagine Morgan might have been one of those people who would eventually succumb to the rather duplicitous nature of online life, where you can be someone different or express opinions that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do as easily in real life. And what I do appreciate about Morgan in this film is that he doesn't pull any punches and he says what he thinks, whether or not people like it. He also makes a fool of himself here with all these really immature pranks that are getting more and more risky, actually, and dangerous. But, when this film came out, psychiatry and psychology were certainly not as advanced as they are today. There weren't as many people taking pills to take care of different illnesses or problems. I imagine therapy was a lot more stern than it is now. We've become much more conscious of mental health problems. We can identify people with depression, or perhaps become aware that they have a different type of disorder, and we can become more supportive and listen to them a bit more. Occasionally some of the stuff online gets a little much, like people putting up all their positivity memes or discussing how they're introverted and very shy, or they're depressed. And sometimes I'm like, okay, you need to go out a little bit more into the world and do some therapy. It can't just all be online. I think that's the danger. And I can see a guy like this falling into that trap where he gets depressed and then going into this echo chamber online, or developing a different personality. It's, that kind of stuff can get a little narcissistic. Obviously there's some people who've gone through some serious things, but I've always found it a little strange when a lot of it just gets regurgitated online and you sort of see everything. I don't know. I'm not the kind of person that wants to say all those things, but saying things out loud is a good thing. It's different than writing them. And in fact, Morgan refers to a shrink that he's seen a couple of times in this movie. He mentions he's going to mention again, I've seen a shrink, he says they have real problems. It makes you wonder if he's actually gone and seen somebody, or if he's just saying that to say, look, I'm making a step towards getting better, or I'm doing a little better than you think I am. It's a bit ambiguous there. And since therapy had a lot more of a stigma back then, that, you were losing your mind or you had serious problems, you wonder how much he would actually follow through with that. Or had he followed through with some therapy earlier and tried to stay a bit away from her, if things would have turned out differently. Of course, there's a lot of questions that this film raises. It answers a lot of things, but it also raises a lot more questions, which is what a lot of really good art does. But also, I think, there's a lot of different things to say. This movie, I guess it actually it does imply that some of the problems that he's having are stemming from the way he grew up and kind of the people around him who are not allowing him to express himself. I mean, this was really on the cusp of a countercultural revolution where young people were definitely challenging the values of their parents and their attitudes towards life. I mean, here he's pushing the mom out of the way, which is not very nice. But, you know, a lot more of that was happening. And even Leonie here is actually amused by this whole thing. As much as she knows in some ways, you know, her mother is right because he's starting to lose his marbles, she just loves it. It just drives her crazy because, I don't know, there's a push and pull here. There's a tug of war going on. And I'm not sure Leonie really totally wants to go back into that world. It's interesting, though. Vanessa Redgrave was in my second favorite film of all time, that I mentioned before, Blow Up, which came out a few months after this. And that film questioned the nature of reality. There was a lot of that going on in late 60s cinema. There is something notable, is that Morgan, you know, as a communist, is portrayed in more of an upbeat and quirky fashion rather than being a spy or somebody evil or somebody with, you know, intentions that you're not sure about. So that was something different for this film. You know, and I mean, its approach to mental health is different. There's a lot of things that you could talk about with that in terms of how things are portrayed now as opposed to how they were portrayed back then. At any rate, let's talk a bit, getting away from mental health issues, about Nan Monroe, who is getting to play Mrs. Henderson and having to deal with an explosion under the bed. She plays Leonie's long-suffering mother. Monroe's screen career spanned 1938 to 1989, which is just 3 years before her death at age 86. She predominantly had roles on British television series. Some of her notable non-Morgan credits include Miss Whitehall in the main ensemble of the 7-episode series The Whitehall Warrior in 1967. Just the year before, when Morgan came out, she was in 3 episodes of The David Copperfield with future Sir Ian McKellen. And she had a 6-episode stint on the 3rd season of the sci-fi series Sapphire and Steel in 1981. That co-starred Joanna Lumley and David McCallum as these two characters trying to stop interdimensional entities from invading our world. That lasted for 4 seasons, and just coincidentally enough, I started watching it on Amazon Prime recently, so it's just funny that actually came up. It's also interesting to talk about all these limited series where there was only 7 episodes, whereas like we're used to, well, actually in the age of cable, we're used to shorter series now, but when I was growing up, you had 22 to 24 episodes. But I usually compliment a lot of British series because the writing is often better. They take more time to craft what they're doing than what's going on here. So, you know, I talk about mental health issues. A lot of times, you know, in the past, a lot of mental health issues were dealt with in terms of psychological thrillers or horror movies, like, you know, 80s slashers movies had villains in a crazed mental state. Even a movie like Split and at this follow-up Glass, which is part of a trilogy with Unbreakable, M. Night Shyamalan and star James McAvoy got criticism for his portrayal of dissociative identity order because it's usually doesn't result in somebody being that violent. You know, a lot of times, a lot of phobias, it's been said a lot of phobias or problems are exaggerated for movies because you want to have the most dramatic scenario possible, but then it's not realistic. And playwright David Mercer faced a little bit of that, and I'm going to get into that in just a minute. You know, sometimes you try to deal with mental illness in a serious way, and it doesn't always come out. You know, I did commentary for another Kino Lorber reissue, which was Mad Love, which is a 1995 movie starring Drew Barrymore and Chris O'Donnell. She plays a young woman with bipolar, although she's misdiagnosed by her own mom as clinically depressed. And he's the young man who falls in love with her, and they try to run off to Mexico because her parents have institutionalized her. You know, they escape, they get out there. They were trying to deal with mental health issues in a more serious way, but the studio kind of screwed around with it, and it didn't really work out the way it should have. A Girl Interrupted 3 years later drew a lot more attention. And since that time, you've had a lot more movies try to deal with mental health issues, and not just in an asylum setting, like, say, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but just dealing with people who are a little different, not crazy or scary, just coping with certain issues. And in the past decade, you've had a lot of Hollywood stars go public with their struggles with depression, and that was a subject that was very taboo before. I mean, people, like back in the 60s, really people didn't talk about their private lives as much as they do today. Everything was an image that you wanted to project to the public, and everything else was kept very private. So that's rather interesting. So I was mentioning writer David Mercer. Should talk about him. He's a British playwright who was born in 1928. Didn't really become a professionally active writer until the late 1950s. He was born in Wakefield in Yorkshire, England, to working-class parents. In fact, his father was a railroad engineer driver. He left school at age 14, first to become a medical laboratory technician, then to join the Royal Navy. After his discharge, Mercer studied painting at King's College, got a BA in Fine Arts at Durham University in 1953. He He went to Paris and tried to be a painter for a year while living with various communist immigrants. That didn't work out. But he returned to London, and he was teaching full-time and had various part-time TV and stage writing gigs until he became a full-time writer in the early 1960s. Now, according to the British Film Institute's website Screen Online, Mercer's first major play in 1961, called Where the Difference Begins, was produced for TV but originally meant for the stage. It was directed by Don Taylor, with whom he'd collaborate for the next 4 years. Now, the themes of that first play were father-son relationships, societal alienation, and Northern English working-class values versus those of the Southern middle class, and that would repeat in a lot of his later work. He did film plays with different themes, like A Climate of Fear being about, it was the anti-nuclear piece. A Way of Living was about a divide growing between a fisherman and a young woman from a mining family who's leaving for university. Presumably, they were a couple. The 2 TV plays he did, aside from Morgan, which came out afterwards, For Tea on Sunday and In Two Minds, both dealt with psychological problems stemming from social alienation. And in fact, In Two Minds was later turned into a film by Ken Loach, who had directed the TV version. The film was called Family Life, came out in 1971. Interestingly enough, For Tea on Sunday features a London man taking an axe to the furniture of a middle-class apartment. Does that remind you a little bit of Morgan? And the original version of In Two Minds was also directed by Loach, as I said, but it was controversial. It starred Anna Cropper as a young woman with schizophrenia and her experiences in a mental hospital, which included electroconvulsive therapy and being the focus of a lecture of medical students. Mental health professionals actually complained about that movie, so they did that back then as well. They found it irresponsible in terms of how her treatment was being represented. Mercer, however, I guess he allegedly drew on his own experiences because he was hospitalized following a nervous breakdown prior to his writing career taking off. So a lot of this stuff kind of comes around. An interesting connection to this movie is that one of his earlier works, which was not put on stage until 1965, was called The Governor's Lady, and it took place in a British colony in Africa. And it was about an elderly man who gradually transforms into a gorilla and attacks his wife. Except that she's actually imagining the whole thing because he's already passed away and the colony that they were overseeing has disbanded. She was having a problem dealing with her environment changing. So some themes that seem to be crossing over in Mercer's work, and obviously Mercer and Reisz dealing with individuals that don't necessarily fit in, who are challenging the values around them or having maybe a little bit of a hard time with reality. Now, a year prior to Morgan hitting the silver screen, Mercer wrote a screenplay for a film called 90 Degrees in the Shade, which was nominated for a Golden Globe for Best English Language Foreign Film. He mostly wrote for the stage and for TV, but he did write the screenplay for the French film version of Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House, which starred Jane Fonda. It came out in 1973. 4 years later, he wrote the script for the Alain Resnais film Providence, starring John Gielgud. That film won 7 César Awards. He got one for Best Screenplay Original Adaptation. I also love the fact that David Mercer wrote a TV movie called Huggy Bear, but no relation to the character from Starsky and Hutch. He was a heavy drinker, died from a heart attack in Israel in 1980, only at age 52. A lot of people associated somehow with this movie, or the people in this movie, had died at young ages. So let's talk a bit more here about Arthur Mullard, who's playing Wally the gorilla. His screen career started in 1939 with an uncredited role in Inspector Hornley. His career ended with an uncredited role in the live-action 101 Dalmatians in 1996. He had an uncredited voice role there. As you can probably guess, Arthur Mullard was known for playing Cockney characters in film and television. He had a lot of uncredited roles in the first 2 decades of his career, a lot of extra and stuntman work. He got more noticed in the 60s. When he was younger, he served in World War II, and he started, I think, as a boxer in the service and then continued afterwards. One of his stunt roles was in the World War II film The Captive Heart in 1946, which starred Michael Redgrave. There's that connection again. Now, in terms of credited roles, Arthur Mullard appeared in 5 episodes of The Army Game in 1959 and 1960, which also featured fellow Morgan castmate Bernard Bresslaw. They didn't interact in this movie, though. And Mullard, was on 3 episodes of The Benny Hill Show in 1962. Speaking of nudity in European productions before American ones, both he and Benny Hill were in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, where Mullard had the smaller role of the big man. I love the fact that he was the gravedigger in the Bargain and Death segment of the Vault of Horror anthology from Amicus Productions back in the early 70s, a follow-up to Tales from the Crypt. Now, the role that brought Mullard fame and notoriety was that of Wally Briggs, and he and his wife Lily Briggs, the 2 fictitious characters, were on 2 different British series that documented their domestic travails. His spouse, Lily, was played by Queenie Watts. The first series they were on, Romany Jones, had a couple other main characters. That ran for 4 seasons between 1972 and 1975. Then the Briggs got their very own show for 2 more seasons called Yus, My Dear, Y-U-S. The Briggs even appeared in a 1973 movie called Holiday on the Buses, so a nice TV film crossover there. I guess in the first TV series, Wally Briggs was more of a layabout scamming the welfare system, but in the second show, he had a respectable job as a bricklayer. He also wrote an autobiography in 1977 called Oh Yes, It's Arthur Mullard, his own moving, funny life story. So here, I want to talk about this location quickly. Llyn Crefydd in North Wales. It's spelled L-L-Y-N, Llyn Crefydd. It's in Snowdonia National Park. It's a natural lake in North Wales. It's a popular tourist destination, a forest to the east, a mountain range to the west, a 2.5-mile hiking trail that circles the lake. You can do trout fishing there. Leonie's house is actually located 5 hours away from there. It's in the southern part of the UK, or southeastern part. So it's a 5-hour drive northwest to Wales. You pass near Oxford and Coventry. So it took them a while to get there, and it took her parents a while to get there as well. Now, you notice some Tarzan clips here, Tarzan and Jane. This is from Tarzan and His Mate, the second of 12 films that starred Johnny Weissmuller as the King of the Jungle. He would later appear in several films and a TV series as a character called Jungle Jim, who was a hunter or adventurer, a competitor to Tarzan in the comic strip world in the mid-1930s. And it looks like, cinematically at least, Weissmuller did not leave the jungle for 24 years because he transitioned from Tarzan to Jungle Jim right away in 1948. So these Tarzan and His Mate clips are humorous because Morgan is struggling to deal with the idea of being an assertive man and bringing out his inner alpha male. And, the early representation of Tarzan and his love, Jane Porter, are campy and funny. They probably didn't think so back in the day, who knows. But, and then, of course, you have the intercutting the real-life animal clips here, which further emphasizes all this childish imagination that Morgan is exhibiting. Now, I never read any of the Tarzan novels, but I discovered that the characters in those books were dumbed down pretty much for most of the Hollywood renditions of the story, which is why the recent Tarzan King of the Jungle movie, which came out in 2016, was praised for being closer to author Edgar Rice Burroughs' original source material. That movie co-starred Alexander Skarsgård and Margot Robbie. So the original Tarzan was the son of 2 aristocrats who died on a trip to Africa. He was raised as a feral child among apes. When he meets Jane, who I think goes there on safari, he falls in love with her, tracks her down in America, so he goes and lives with her for a while in her family's estate. They later moved to England. He disliked modern civilization, so they eventually got an estate in Africa, and they had further adventures from there. The more recent film starts with him living in England with Jane, and then he's called to Africa to battle slavery and diamond mines. So the use of Tarzan here is for comic effect and is obviously dated. Tarzan and the Lone Ranger are these dated American icons that are very hard to pull off. The Lone Ranger movie with Johnny Depp and Armie Hammer just tanked. And I don't know how easy it is to pull off Tarzan. Even this new movie, even though it made $360 million, that's twice what its budget was, which means it basically broke even. A fun fact, the estate of Edgar Rice Burroughs was located in what is now called the Tarzana neighborhood of Los Angeles. So it was named after that famed character. As we can see here now, things are becoming very different. Morgan is starting to lose his grip on reality. He's having problems. And the comedic aspect of it is not so funny. They marketed this as a comedy, but it does take a dark turn later on. It's black comedy. So while we're hearing we heard some of this music, let's talk about composer Johnny Dankworth. He passed away in 2010. He was more than just a British film composer. He was a jazz composer. He played sax and clarinet. After studying at London's Royal Academy of Music and then playing alto sax and clarinet for the Royal Air Force Music Services, he began his professional music career. He actually played with Charlie Parker at the Paris Jazz Festival in 1949 and lent him his saxophone. He formed the Johnny Dankworth Quartet in the late 40s and then had 2 groups in the 50s, first the Johnny Dankworth 7 and then his big band, Johnny Dankworth and his orchestra. The latter received critical acclaim and became the first British group to play Newport Jazz Festival that happened in 1959. Soon afterward, Dankworth got connected with Duke Ellington, and they were friends until the latter passed away in 1974. Dankworth even recorded a tribute album for Ellington. Now, Johnny's recording of Galt McDermott's African Waltz became a top 10 hit in the UK in 1961. It's been covered by many artists, and Ronnie Stevenson's drum parts allegedly inspired drummer Mitch Mitchell's drum parts for the Jimi Hendrix Experience song Manic Depression. A number of well-known people were band members or guest musicians on Dankworth recordings: Bob Brookmeyer, Phil Woods, Dudley Moore, Dave Holland, John McLaughlin. He also appeared in a film called All Night Long with jazz legends Dave Brubeck and Charles Mingus in the 60s. Dankworth played live with Ella Fitzgerald and Lionel Hampton. He toured Europe a lot. He recorded with the likes of Dizzy Gillespie, Benny Goodman, Herbie Hancock, Oscar Peterson. His scoring career ran from 58 to 75. He even composed the original theme for the Avengers for the seasons where Ian Hendry and Honor Blackman were on. A majority of the movies he composed probably won't be as familiar to American audiences, but he did score Karel Reisz's 1959 documentary film We Are the Lambeth Boys, also his first movie Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, first fiction film, as well as two mid-60s spy spoofs, Modesty Blaze and Fathom, the latter with Raquel Welch, that were rather unusual and interesting. Recorded a lot of albums. He and his son recorded, I think, a couple albums together as the Alec and John Dankworth Generation Big Band. John's daughter, Jackie Dankworth, spelled Jacqui, is a singer. His wife was Dame Cleo Lane, a well-known jazz and pop singer who was praised by London Sunday Times as quite simply the best singer in the world and as a national treasure by the New York Times. They did a lot. They did 6 albums together. They were actively involved in music education. They had a music school on their property, which is still going after their death. She became Dame Commander of the UK in 1997, and he a Knight Bachelor in 2006. So right here, we are seeing definitely a break from reality for Morgan. Clearly, he doesn't think anything's going to happen to him. It seems like no matter what you do with this guy, you have to keep pushing him and pushing him. And that it tells you also kind of the power of the mind and power of suggestion and the power of self-delusion, that you can just really convince yourself of things that aren't true. What I find interesting is, these daydreams he has. As a kid, I used to daydream really strongly. I remember even in 4th grade having a very vivid daydream that was inspired by the $6 Million Man, actually. And I do actually remember literally being pulled out of whatever was going on in class and being far away. It's just amazing that as an adult, he still has this ability. It's actually rather impressive. It's just too bad he can't use it for anything positive. Instead, he's just going to sit here and roll his eyes at, have the judge roll his eyes at him for just his sheer audacity. But where he's going is not going to be particularly fun. So here he is going to Her Majesty's Prison Wormwood Scrubs, which is located in the White City area of West London. Now, this is called a Category B prison. The UK has 4 categories of prison, with A being maximum security and D being minimum security, so we just avoided maximum security. I don't know if the classification changed since before this movie came out. We don't get any sense of what happened to him in prison, and it couldn't have been all that fun. I mean, he's not very good at intimidating many civilians, so you can imagine what would have happened to him. I mean, he's eager to go into jail, but I'm not sure it would have been such the best experience for him. And in fact, Rolling Stones guitarist Keith Richards spent a night there in 1967 when he was arrested on drug charges, and he reportedly did not like it too much. Now, according to a BBC report in December 2017, Wormwood Scrubs was actually more dangerous to guards than a prisoner. They've had 40 to 50 violent incidents per month, including assaults on officers. Some inmates only spending an hour a day outside of their cells, really in lockdown. A year before that report, there were infestations of rats and cockroaches found at prison Wormwood Scrubs. It's just, wow. So you can imagine if he knew what he was getting into, Morgan might not have been in such a rush to get in there. And that's one part of the film that's a little unrealistic. Like, what happened? How did this affect him? He just gets out and he's just backed up to his old tricks. And I guess some people are like that. It sort of depends on what part of the prison population he was put into. And it's sort of the same with that gorilla suit at the end when he gets, when it's on fire, because he actually, you'd think that his skin would have gotten burned and it would probably have required some surgery. And I don't think they had skin grafts. Well, they probably had certain technology, but not like it is today. But those are sort of movie things that you have to forgive. Otherwise, if you think too much about it, it'll drive you crazy. Another film that came out this year I think about when I watch this movie now is King of Hearts. And that was a French film directed by Philippe de Broca, a World War II period piece starring Alan Bates as a Scottish soldier who's been sent into a French town that has been abandoned. There were German forces occupying it. They retreated, but they secretly left a massive bomb there that could be set off by the clock tower in the middle of the village. So they're hoping that the British or the UK forces come in and it will just be blown up. So a problem here is, on top of having to find the bomb, which they find out about, the local inmates from the asylum have gotten free and have taken over the place and formed their own little society, because now that they're outside of the confines of the institution, they're allowed to dress up in other people's clothes and play act anywhere that they want. So, Bates's soldier gets to know these people during his brief stay there, and once the whole conflict and the ends and the bomb is defused, as you can imagine, by the end of the story, he decides to join them in the asylum. He shows up naked as if he's being born or reborn, and he's perfectly happy to become part of their society rather than dealing with the lunacy of the world at large. This is obviously an idealized situation because none of those people are violent at all. I mean, maybe it wasn't that kind of an asylum to begin with. And the film begs the question, who is really sane? And King of Hearts, and to a degree too, Morgan, it resonates today because we have a country now where we have weekly, if not daily, shootings that we've become so used to that there's no more sense of outrage. You have so many political scandals and watching that you can't keep up and that we've become numb to. And in that way, I mean, you wonder, who is really crazy? And I think in Morgan, he's trying to make sense of society. So perhaps he's wondering, am I crazy or is the rest of the world crazy? Because here he is, he's a man who was raised with these communist ideals that don't really benefit him in this society. He's surrounded by a capitalist society that has a growing consumer culture that he doesn't understand. So King of Hearts and Morgan kind of deal with the concept of sanity in very different ways, but they're both, very interesting films. Here, of course, we have the imagery of King Kong and Tarzan playing into this, and it's going to come very much to come into play here with this wedding. So let's go to Leonie and Charles's wedding, which is atop 45 Park Lane. 45 Park Lane is a hotel now that's nestled between Stanhope Gate and Curzon Street along Park Lane. It actually overlooks Hyde Park, and it is this is the roof of the former Playboy Club. So according to the Dorchester Collection, which is a company which owns 9 prestigious hotels, including 45 Park Lane, the building dates back to the early 1960s. It was designed by Walter Gropius, founder of the Bauhaus School, who also designed the MetLife building in New York City. The Playboy Club, the old Playboy Club, opened at 45 Park Lane in 1965 and stayed in business until the early 1980s. It was obviously an appropriately swanky address for this wedding. There's actually a new Playboy Club that opened up in London nearly 10 years ago at 14 Old Park Lane in Mayfair, which is a 4-minute cab ride away from this old location. These buildings I'm referencing are all near Buckingham Palace. And just kind of a side note, because now we're going to get some King Kong footage coming in here because Morgan is going to imagine himself scaling the side of the building. I've done a lot of writing for Playboy on the digital and print side over the last 20 years, and between 2005 and 2015, I did Blu-ray and DVD reviews, and the very first movie I was asked to review was King Kong, which was Hugh Hefner's favorite movie. So luckily, Hef and I agreed on that. That would be kind of awkward if I hadn't liked the movie, but it's still a classic, as dated as it looks. It's still fun to watch. So here we are in a very precarious situation for everybody. Notice how all the men here, by the way, they're all in all their suits look alike. And this just makes me think of when I look at pictures of American men from the 50s, like when they're at a lunch counter, like in one of those luncheonettes, or they're getting breakfast in the morning, and you see them all wearing the exact same costume, the same kind of suit and the same kind of tie. And, you think about the fact that back then men didn't really have a whole lot of options for dressing well. I mean, I think it's gotten better since then. Maybe I'm wrong, but it feels like I think there's a few more options, or at least people think there are more options. Women have always seemed to have more possibility with clothes. They have more fun with clothes. Men I guess men don't really care so much of that either, which is why it's always good to be a sharp-dressed man, and why ZZ Top capitalized on that idea for that video back in the 80s. So at any rate, something I'd like to toss in before Morgan tosses in here is, I found an interview with Meryl Streep, another one with Jeremy Irons, talking about working with Karel Reisz on the set of The French Lieutenant's Woman. There we go, some cake in the face. So neither of them really got a lot of notes from the director about their performances, and Streep has noted that he was very delicate in his handling of actors, and that everything was fine. If he didn't like something, he wouldn't be able to really tell you, or he wouldn't tell you what he didn't like about it. He would just make you do it over and over again. So hopefully whatever was going on in here didn't require that many takes. It's like he often seemed to let the actors take the lead in what they wanted to do unless he really needed it to change. I found a BBC radio interview from 2012 that included director Stephen Frears, and there was a discussion about the connection between a writer and a director, and they pulled out this archived Karel Reisz audio quote about how he felt that the director's job was not simply to translate the words of the writer from the page and put it on screen, but in fact sometimes to challenge that. He actually didn't always agree with what a writer had done, even though he liked to work closely with writers. So that would create a tension that gave a film its special quality. And that's an interesting idea, actually, you know. Of course, working with writers didn't always work out. Author John Lahr revealed that Arthur Miller had reportedly blamed the failure of Everybody Wins on the box office on Reisz, who became depressed by that for a year and then eventually just stopped making movies. He felt betrayed by Miller in that. So that hotel that you just saw there, by the way, that was the Royal Garden Hotel, and I think it was identified on real streets as the Dorchester Hotel. I love here, by the way, not the stealing of the motorcycle, but the fact that it's a female motorcycle rider, which probably wasn't common back in the day. But anyway, the Royal Garden Hotel was on the opposite side of Hyde Park. It was on this 45 Park Lane is the southeast corner. The Royal Garden was on the southwest corner. And here we are, by the way, going through Beauchamp Place, a fashionable shopping area, and the Knightsbridge district of London. I don't know how many of those businesses remain today. But getting back just to the Royal Garden Hotel for a minute, you know, it was erected as a palace hotel in the 1800s, but it was a different building, and thanks to a Labour government grant, it was demolished in the early 1960s, completely rebuilt and reopened in 1965 as the Royal Garden Hotel. It's undergone about $75 million worth of renovations since then. Most recent ones, I think, to cash in on the 2012 Olympics, and owned by a different company now called the Goodwood Group. But it's still a very well-known place. Now here we are in Cremorne Wharf, which is now part of the Loch Road pumping station, part of London's new super sewer system. There's a problem where 39 million tons of sewage have been flowing into the Thames every year, which is not good. So that little part of that pier on the wharf there, that's gone. So no more stunt driving in gorilla suits, because you'd actually look even messier, I guess, than he does right here. Because can you imagine all that sludge and stuff in the sewer? That's just not very good. And so right now, of course, we're getting to the point of the real breakdown. And what I specifically like about this imagery here anyway is the fact that Morgan's going to have a hard time getting this costume off. And that's the point symbolically where he realizes that he really is, he's transformed into this gorilla character. And it's really of his own doing. I mean, is this really who he is? I mean, maybe it is, but I'm not sure what all that stuff is. I guess he was trying to make himself, he was trying to puff up his chest there. It's all a charade. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of not getting out of something. I actually had a leather jacket where the zipper got stuck, and I was sitting there because I was in a place, I was sitting down maybe at the theater, and I needed to get it off because it was warm in there, and it took a little while. I felt for a moment like, oh my God, like, what would happen if I can't get out of this jacket? Like, what am I going to do? I mean, I guess I'd have to get a knife or something, and I wanted to keep the jacket. Can you imagine being in this mask with no air holes? And imagine if that got stuck to you. Because I'm thinking about the fact that his butt was on fire, and he would probably get some sort of burns from it. I'm amazed that nothing happened out of that. But again, that's a bit of a movie contract. So we're going to look here. This whole area, I believe, is the former Chelsea Basin. It's no longer looks like this. It's been repurposed into a giant modern housing complex, a lot of condos particularly, at Thames Avenue and Chelsea Harbour Drive. I mean, how times have changed. I mean, it looks better now. I get annoyed sometimes. I joke about Williamsburg, you know, that it's like the movie Dark City, where the building, every day the buildings change, some rise, others fall, and the whole landscape changes. That part of Brooklyn's becoming like that the kind of gentrification is too fast. So, you know, this area probably looks better and has a better use now than it did back then. But the use it's having right now is that Morgan is about to finally put on the straitjacket that you probably figured he was going to get put into, and perhaps he thought he was going to get into. This is going to lead up to a final sequence. Here I give props to Warner again for doing this.
Okay, Charlie, take it away.
I don't like heights to begin with, but it's one thing if your limbs are flailing around and maybe you could feel like you could hold on to that hook. It's another thing to make sure that whatever you're hanging on to, or whatever that's actually attached to, is not going to rip and break and drop you. So, Stunt by David Warner. I also appreciate the fact that in the non-digital era, this is a very surreal scene, and it's entirely done with available props, which is great. And this image kind of reminds me of Brazil. If you've seen Brazil at the end, you kind of know why. Now we need to bring up, there's on the right there's Leon Trotsky. So he plays into this final scene. I should mention just a little bit about him. He was a Soviet revolutionary whose own version of Marxism was called Trotskyism, which is, we talked about in conjunction with Vanessa Redgrave and her political beliefs. So Trotsky joined the Bolsheviks party with Vladimir Lenin and became a communist leader prior to the October Revolution of 1917, through which the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia and begat the Soviet Union. Trotsky later became founder and commander of the Red Army and a major figure in the Bolshevik victory in the Russian Civil War between 1918 and 1922. But he soon ran afoul of Joseph Stalin, who took over after Lenin died in the early 1920s. Stalin was bringing more bureaucracy to the Soviet Union. Lenin had already, thanks to the Red Terror period, brought in more of a police state concept that Stalin, as a dictator, really used to clamp down on people. Trotsky was defiant, fell out of favor with Stalin, was stripped of various titles he held. He was expelled from the Communist Party in late 1927. There's Stalin. And exiled from the Soviet Union in early 1929. But he continued to rail against Stalin and his bureaucracy, which led to his assassination by a Spanish communist with an ice pick in the summer of 1940. So this sequence here is probably inspired by that. There's some music going on in the background, again, which you might remember, that we had heard earlier on, the socialist song, The Red Flag. And there's some other things being chanted there in the background, presumably connected to the Communist Manifesto. I think of this whole execution sequence, and it also reminds me of the Romanov family, who were killed by the Bolsheviks in July of 1918, executed by firing squad. But I think the Trotsky connection is more obvious and more relevant in this case. I mean, Trotsky, Lenin, Trotsky, Lenin, Stalin, they all had different views on things. I guess there's not enough time to get into that. But the imagery here is interesting, especially because Leonie is going to come out as a Russian revolutionary, and she's going to be the main person who guns him down. See, he was called a class traitor by his mother. So is this like the idea that he's betrayed his ideals because he keeps wanting to go back to this woman of wealth, and therefore he doesn't believe in the communist ideals that his mother preached to him? Is this a sort of way of trying to reconcile what's happened to him? I mean, obviously it's a strange, surreal fantasy sequence, but very much connected to his communist leanings. And I think it's it. He doesn't really know where he belongs. And Mercer himself struggled with, as he talked about, being a theoretical communist and wanting things to be different in a country where it just wasn't going to work. I mean, I love David Warner's performance here. It's great. It's very edgy. Love the camera work. Great set piece. And an interesting way to kind of show his complete break. And Trotsky evidently was assassinated in Mexico. So, and he had moved around a bit too. There's so much. It's funny. I learned so much of this stuff in high school, and then of course you have to be reminded of it. And that's an interesting image also right there with Vanessa Redgrave, because she did believe in Trotskyism. So there she is being used in a context that's very different, because she's not a violent person, and she's not leading that kind of revolution. She believed in democratic socialism, not the kind of sort of Russian fascism that you have. That's a great image right there. It would really be interesting to find out which cinematographer worked on which shots. I guess maybe if I studied more of their work, I might be able to break that down later on. That's not something I just really had enough time. Speaking of controversial sequences, Karel Reisz also produced This Sporting Life, which was a Lindsay Anderson film that came out in 1963. And in fact, Lindsay Anderson made a film in 1968 called If with Malcolm McDowell, and there was a sequel, Oh Lucky Man. But If had a very controversial sequence at the end. It takes place at a boarding school where there's a lot of hazing and abuse going on by some students against other ones, some privileged students. And so at the end, Malcolm McDowell's character and a couple of people just start shooting from the rooftops at these students in like the big campus down below. And at the time, that definitely shocked people. I mean, that's way pre-Columbine. It's well before Heathers, where Christian Slater's character is trying to blow up a school, except it takes it one step further. And when I watched it at first, I'm like, that's it. But then I thought about the fact that that film came out in 1968. And yes, that's it. That's the part that, really shocked people, and not something, again, that you would be doing today. So finally, we are here at the asylum where Morgan's going to be treated. I'm not sure we know what the name of it is, but this lovely location is White Lodge in Richmond Park. It's home to the Royal Ballet School, which has been there since 1955, though for the first year it had a different name. The school itself was founded in 1926, but changed names when it received a royal charter. White Lodge was completed in 1730 and originally served as a hunting lodge for George II, and after that time it served numerous royal occupants and people of distinction. The last person to live there who left, I think in 1954, was Colonel James Veitch. This is one of two sites that the Royal Ballet School has. Students that are ages 11 to 16 attend there, and then students that are aged 16 to 19 attend the Covent Garden location in London proper. I'm actually rather curious what the school thought of the hammer and sickle floral arrangement that he put together. I don't know if Morgan would have a career in that. Probably not. This is a very interesting closing sequence for the two of them because he finds out that she's pregnant with his baby. I guess that's the perfect revenge in this kind of class warfare, that now she will be carrying his baby, and therefore they will still be connected somehow. I don't know how she's going to actually handle this with her husband and how he's going to deal with it. This seems to be a pretty fitting ending to this story. Morgan doesn't get the girl. However, there's still something that they share. They've created something that's a product of the love that they shared and probably really still do share. It's difficult for him, I imagine, because he's probably on medication and he's getting over the whole relationship and she's happily married. And yet somehow they can't stay away from each other. And believe me, this is not an uncommon story. Maybe it's not something that's told all the time. But when you share a connection with somebody like that, sometimes it's really, really hard to break. And I think the story is still pretty relevant today because normally you have a political pendulum that swings back and forth, creates a sense of balance at times. But lately, I think people in the US and the UK can really relate to the fact that we have a pendulum that's kind of split apart and is going hard in either direction. And it's harder for people to see each other's points of view. This couple manages to transcend that because I don't think the politics are so deeply ingrained in their relationship. We don't really hear about political debates or see political debates between them. I don't think she takes his communist leanings that seriously, and I don't think he's that enamored with it. And I think if you take that out of it, because communism just ultimately doesn't work, if you take that out of it and look at it as a period of its time, but then replace perhaps the communist aspect with something else, you can see how it's a story about somebody who's trying to find their sense of identity in a society where they don't feel that they fit in. And I think that's something that people can relate to more and more these days. In that sense, there's something very contemporary about it, even though it takes place in the mid-1960s. At any rate, I hope you enjoyed the movie and the commentary. Perhaps you can catch some of Karel Reisz's other films on streaming. A lot of them aren't available right now. Perhaps after this has been out for a while, it will be available on streaming. But hey, you own it, so relish this copy.